Welcome to the Manumission podcast, the show dedicated to unshackling ourselves from the status quo. Here's your host, H.H. Morris.
Hey friends, I hope everyone had a happy Christmas. Just wanted to let you know, decided to give you kind of a best of series here during the hiatus for the holidays, and decided to give you the two-part series of the development of government that I did a while back in the previous podcast. I think you guys will enjoy it, and that'll tide you over until we resume again on our regular schedule on January 8th. Okay, here we go.
My goal here is to explore the factors that have allowed for governments to develop and grow throughout history. I'm approaching this by addressing two things. First, the human factor, that is to say, those aspects of the human condition that have allowed people to accept those governments, and second, the external, structural, and systemic factors that have perpetuated governments up to our time. We will deal with the human factor first in this episode, as it's fundamental to understanding how the idea of government was able to take hold in the first place. I think that it's impossible to understand the historical piece without first recognizing how certain aspects of the human condition have made it possible for the external factors to affect people in the way that they did, and that's why I wanted to address them initially. In the second episode, we'll discuss the history of the development of governments from hunter-gatherer societies to early civilization, Western civilization specifically, since that's what I've studied, and how it evolved all the way up to modern times. I will then put forth my argument that free or stateless societies are part and parcel of this evolution, and that we are indeed approaching a tipping point in this progression. So let's get started with the human side of this analysis. The two most fundamental aspects of government are power and authority. So let's touch on power briefly. It is a reality of human existence that there are some people in our midst who crave power. Notice that I said human existence and not human nature, as it is unclear, at least to me, that the penchant for power, namely to be able to control other people's lives and property, is something that is in most people's constitution. In fact, there are some studies that suggest that such persons are genetically predisposed to that tendency, and that they are actually a minority in the population, thankfully. And this is completely anecdotal, but I personally don't know anyone who looks for the opportunity to force others to do what they want them to do. Now, a lot of people, including myself, would like for some people to behave or not behave in certain ways, usually the same way that we behave, right? But we don't actually seek the means to force them to do so. Personally, my default setting is that every politician or person who seeks that type of power is a megalomaniacal narcissist. I think that is probably the healthiest position to hold, but I digress. Since I'm not a psychologist, I don't pretend to have a clear answer to this conundrum, but I think that most reasonable people would agree that such people indeed exist. In fact, the existence of the state itself is proof positive of this. Otherwise, we would already live in a stateless society, right? Now, power can come in many forms: physical strength or force, wealth, personality or charisma, knowledge, and so on. But the highest form of power is political power. That is, the ability to have others do what you want them to do on a large scale. Governments have used some or all of the types of powers that I just listed, and obviously others as well throughout history. So let's talk about these real quick outside of the context of government. The most basic form of power, and the power that we most readily observe in nature, is physical power or strength. But mere physical strength or force is very ineffective in human affairs, because force usually engenders resentment on the part of those whom it's foisted upon, and there's always the reality of someone being stronger than you. In terms of using force against a group, you always run the risk of them mounting a resistance against you, and that can get messy. When individuals use force to get their way, the results are most often short-lived and costly. So if we think back to the island exercise in the previous show, if we have a situation where there is no, quote, law enforcement or, courts of law and all that stuff, if you come over and it's just the two people on the island and you want to do something, force the other person to do something, and you initiate violence, even if you believe that you're stronger than the person, it could end up costing you dearly. So even though you might, fight with the person and you end up, quote unquote, winning, you might end up with, a broken arm or a broken nose, bloody nose, whatever. And even if you ultimately got what it is that you wanted, you still, didn't leave the exchange unscathed. So again, we can see how at this level, that kind of power or force is not very useful. But when we talk about the state, we'll see how this form of power has been used most often and to great effect. But it has only been possible by increasing that scale of force exponentially. And even in those cases, it has usually led to the fall of kingdoms, empires, and even civilizations. So let's talk about wealth. When it comes to wealth, you might be able to hire people to do what you want them to do, but you are always limited by the amount of money and resources you have as to how many people you can hire or bribe even, and for how long. Conversely, some people will not be willing to do your bidding, no matter how much you offer them, if they regard that your agenda is detrimental to themselves or others. Many people, especially on the left, believe that this is the ultimate power, wealth that is, and that's why they rail against big business. Libertarians often criticize and condemn big businesses and industries as well, but in our case, it's not based on the size of their bank accounts, but on the fact that they have these protections and advantages that they enjoy from governments that other businesses, usually smaller ones, don't benefit from. While leftist sole complaint lies with the amount of money that a company has amassed, since to them that in and of itself is shows greed, and they have this steadfast belief that being so successful could only have been possible by exploiting others. But I disagree with that belief, and wealth is definitely not the highest form of power. Another way that we could see this is think of how some wealthy people who ostensibly can have everything they want still strive to have political power. If wealth was the ultimate power, then no rich person would ever seek political office. And, good examples would be Michael Bloomberg or, Arnold Schwarzenegger or Mitt Romney, all of these guys. I don't want to give examples of politicians that have actually become rich while in power. For my argument, I'm talking about the ones who actually were very successful and were already very rich. And I'm talking about, in the case of Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire, and in both Arnold Schwarzenegger and Mitt Romney, they were worth hundreds of millions of dollars before they ever started going after these political offices. And so that is, I think, a good argument that shows that that wealth is not the ultimate in that power scale, and that it is indeed political power that is its highest form. So onto personality. In some cases, people are able to get their way or convince others by using charisma and other personality traits that some might find appealing. This is also a limited type of power and usually only works on small groups, given that those traits are highly subjective. Not everyone will fall prey to such influence. In the case that you're trying to do something that is self-serving or detrimental to others, many will be able to see right through you and your motives. And good examples of this are cult leaders and demagogues, and even very well-known politicians, such as you could think of Mussolini or even Bill Clinton and any other well-known politician that seems to have almost a cult of personality around them. I also listed knowledge as a type of power. In this context, I'm referring to real knowledge based on actual facts. But knowledge is less of a power to make others what you want, make others do what you want them to do, and more of an influence builder. And it also has its limitations. Some people who are ignorant about a certain topic or ignorant overall might not be swayed by it. For example, just because someone knows a lot about astrophysics doesn't mean that he or she would be able to get a construction worker to do what they wanted, or to get something from him or her. In fact, knowledge is a power at the individual level that is best used defensively against the other types of power that I discussed previously. Think of the now hackneyed phrase, knowledge is power, right? We have all heard that before. But it's cliche for a reason, obviously. I bring up knowledge in this analysis because it's important to recognize its defensive power, and because, as we'll see in the next episode, governments have used it, or the lack thereof, to gain and maintain power throughout history. It's in its privation that it comes into play here. Again, on the next show, we'll see how the ruling classes having a monopoly on knowledge and information throughout the ages has been a useful method of controlling the masses. So you can see that those who seek to control others can use several forms of power to achieve their ends. We have also seen that those powers are limited in their breadth and scope of what they can achieve on an individual level. History, however, has shown that the best way to gain and keep control or power on a large scale is by building a system or systems that use all of those forms of power and others. But such systems can only exist if they have legitimacy. And the only way that such a system can have legitimacy, at least in the eyes of those living under it, is if they perceive that system and those who manage it as having some sort of authority. Those systems or apparatuses of authority are what we refer to as governments. So in order to explore this phenomenon of government, we have to explore the concept of authority. Authority is a concept that is completely illusory. It can only manifest itself if individuals believe that it exists. For example, if everyone was hypnotized right now to not believe that the government has any authority, it would instantly cease to exist. It would stop receiving any funding. No one would follow any of its rules or orders from politicians, and there would not be enough enforcers to be able to do anything about it. Zip, zero, nada. As a matter of fact, the enforcers would not even be able to get paid, so most would leave their posts immediately, and the ones who stay, perhaps due to a sense of duty or patriotism, would have to follow suit in short order once they realized that their efforts to get back to the status quo were futile, and thus the politicians and bureaucrats would be left sitting in their desk with nothing to do except maybe surf through monster.com looking for real jobs, I guess. I recommend studying some of Larkin Rose's material, especially his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, for an in-depth analysis on this topic, because this is a huge issue that needs to be analyzed, and no one does it better than Larkin Rose. But I digress again. At this point, you might be asking, why go through all of this rigmarole if on the previous episode we learned how to, deduce natural rights and, develop these universal principles, and they clearly show already, and we know now, how the state doesn't have the right or authority for most everything that they do. Well, although those principles go back several hundred years, as far back as Rene Descartes, John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and other thinkers, The study of history and human social evolution shows us that indeed some people have been able to convince others that they have authority over them, even since the advent of these ideas and concepts like natural rights. So I think it's worth exploring why this has been the case, and in the hopes of breaking that cycle. In my opinion, there are a few aspects of the human condition that have allowed this to happen. First and foremost, fear. Unlike the instinctual, reactionary, and sometimes conditioned fear that other animals possess, human fear is much more complex. For instance, animals are naturally afraid of predators and other things that might pose a threat to them, right? But that form of fear is merely instinctual and it's totally unexamined by them. In other words, it's not something that they reflect upon. The gazelle doesn't go to the therapist and try to, shake their irrational fear of lions, right? It's just part of their constitution, or it's part of who they are, and it's instinctual. Animals might also develop some fears from negative physical experiences like getting hurt by something or someone else, but that is, again, the extent of their fears. You can't, for example, threaten a dog by telling it that you will kill them or their family in the future if they don't fetch your slippers, because they don't even have the concept of future. And, putting aside the fact that we have no ability to communicate such a threat, and that inability to even communicate also speaks to their limitations in cognition and in just brain function. But humans also possess that same natural instinctual fear that animals do, but the more complex aspect to it is due to our awareness of our existence. That is, finding ourselves in a particular place and time in the universe, as well as our awareness of death. This makes for a more complicated and nuanced emotion of fear that makes us vulnerable to many situations that other animals are immune to, most notably threats, extortion, and brainwashing, for instance. The awareness of our imminent demise and our fragility as humans create a level of anxiety over our own security and that of the ones that we love that other creatures don't experience. Those who have sought to gain power over others have exploited this reality by convincing a large amount of the population that they can provide them with such security. So, in order to ease this anxiety, people have been, and most still are, willing to give up some of their liberty and property. Ironically, as we'll see in the next episode, it has been those people in power who have contributed most to the overall uncertainty and insecurity of the populations they purport to protect and serve by either antagonizing other governments or creating false boogeymen to justify their existence. It's for this reason that I regard fear as the lifeblood of the state. The level of violence that the advent of government brought with it, at first externally and then internally, set off a cycle of violence that created ever more, quote, broken people whose fears were more easily tapped into by those who sought power. Again, in the next episode, we will explore how those systems came about and how it became easier for rulers to keep this charade going throughout the history of civilization. The other human factor that I consider a root cause for the development and perpetuation of governments is our epistemological limitations. That's just a fancy word for knowledge, how humans know things, how we learn things. It's a fact of our nature that every generation starts from scratch in this regard. One need only think about how every parent throughout history has had to teach their kids that fire is hot. And it's not until the kid actually gets burned that he or she learns that lesson. I mean, how many times have you advised even your adult friends or one of your family members against doing something in particular because you've already gone through it and you know that that's not the best course to take, only for them to do it anyway and learn the hard way. Well, that's a perfect microcosm of the lessons we have learned, or not, throughout history. Every generation has had to experience the consequences of government for itself, and thus any societal improvements take a very long time to develop and take shape. In this case, we're talking between 10 and 12,000 years. Unfortunately, the bad decisions and experiences of our precursors were not passed on genetically from generation to generation so that we could start where they left off. In addition, our access to knowledge and information has been quite limited throughout our history due to several circumstances. During our early history, humans had little information about the world around them, much less the universe, and led lives focused merely on survival. As certain discoveries and advancements were made in several fields of study, such as astronomy, philosophy, history, and others, most of this newfound knowledge was relegated to the ruling classes, who were the group that had time and resources to devote to them. However, it's important to note that it was indeed the regular people who tended to make advancements in terms of making their everyday lives and work easier with things like tools and machinery. And as we shall see later on, this fact, coupled with other advancements, would eventually free them up enough to be able to gain knowledge in areas that had up to that point not been available to them. This last point brings me to a crucial fact that I need to address in a quick tangent. We can't have a comprehensive analysis of this topic without studying economics, Austrian economics to be precise, given that they actually account for human behavior and the decision-making process. Since I'm not an expert in economics, I'm merely providing a big picture overview of history and the human factors as they pertain to the creation of the state, and I don't want to sully my analysis and send someone down the wrong path by providing incorrect or incomplete economic information. I only mention it in anticipation of some concerns some fellow libertarians might have with this analysis, and as an opportunity to implore anyone who is interested in the liberty movement to start studying economics as I have. I mean, we can philosophize until we are blue in the face and study history for the rest of our lives, but unless we have a solid understanding of at least basic economics, we will always fall prey to the methods of status. So, while our social evolution has been very slow and the lessons we've learned have taken thousands of years to develop, there's something about human nature that has yielded us net positive results: our creativity and ingenuity, especially in the marketplace. And here is where we would benefit from being conversant on economics. Even through all the trials and tribulations that people have experienced across the ages, and even with all the limitations imposed on them by governments, humans have found ways to improve their overall condition through advancements in technology that have only been possible through the market. And that's not to say that governments haven't also turned around and used some of those technologies for evil. You know, we can think of a few off the top of my head. Weapons, writing, atomic energy, the internet, and how they have used them as a means to control people. But in general, humans have improved their lot in life through the entrepreneurial spirit and ingenuity. And no time in history has shown this to be the case more than the modern era. So now that I have outlined how the main aspects of power and authority, as well as how fear and our limitations with knowledge and information have opened the door to our domination, I will proceed to illustrate what that actually looked like throughout history. In the next episode, I'll explore the rise of government by providing an overview of prehistoric societies, then the advent of civilization and how the structure of the state came to be, how it has evolved, and where we stand today in the quest for a truly free society.
If you want to know how you can help me keep the show going, or if you have a question, comment, or recommendation,
You can contact me directly or through social media. Find out how to do all that by visiting Manumission.com.